The grenade left his hand at exactly the wrong angle. Private First Class Douglas Jacobson knew this in the half-second between release and impact, that microscopic eternity where physics and fate intersect. It was February 23rd, 1945, the fourth day of fighting on Iwo Jima, and he had just thrown an M26 fragmentation grenade at a Japanese Type 22 pillbox from a distance of approximately 12 feet. The throw was too high. The grenade would clear the firing aperture entirely, sail over the reinforced concrete structure, and detonate harmlessly in the volcanic ash behind it, which meant the Japanese machine gun crew inside would have perhaps 3 seconds to traverse their weapon and cut him down before he could reach cover. He was standing fully exposed on black volcanic sand, having left his position to get close enough for an effective throw. There was nowhere to go. The Marines around him watched, suspended in that same eternal moment, knowing what was about to happen. The grenade hit the top edge of the firing port. By pure chance, by an accident of trajectory and timing that no amount of training could replicate, it bounced downward, into the aperture, into the pillbox itself. Jacobson was already diving for cover when the explosion came, muffled by several feet of reinforced concrete and sand, followed immediately by secondary detonations as ammunition inside the pillbox cooked off. The machine gun that had been firing seconds earlier went silent. The position was neutralized. His squad mates would later tell him it was the luckiest throw they had ever seen. Jacobson would spend the rest of his life wondering if luck had anything to do with it, or if desperation had simply forced him into a position where the only possible outcome was either miraculous success or immediate death. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This moment, this single grenade throw that shouldn't have worked, represented something larger than one Marine's survival. It crystallized the essential problem of fighting for Iwo Jima, an island where every yard of advance required someone to move forward into certain death, where the mathematics of casualties made every tactical decision a calculation of acceptable loss. The Japanese had built their defenses specifically to force this kind of close-quarters fighting, to negate American advantages in artillery and air power, to create situations where courage and firepower meant less than proximity and luck. And they had succeeded brilliantly. The pillboxes, bunkers, and tunnels honeycombing Iwo Jima were engineered to withstand anything except a direct assault by infantry willing to come close enough to be killed, which meant the Americans had to provide that infantry, had to send men forward into positions where survival was improbable, and success depended on actions that looked suicidal to anyone watching. The question that haunted every Marine on Iwo Jima was not whether they would have to make these attacks. The island's defenses guaranteed it. The question was whether they would survive when their turn came, and whether the men watching would remember it as bravery or simply as the inevitable outcome of impossible tactical situations. Douglas Jacobson's grenade throw, the one that bounced into the pillbox against all probability, would become one story among thousands from Iwo Jima. But it illustrated the central truth of that battle with perfect clarity. Sometimes the only way forward required accepting death as the most likely outcome and moving anyway. Douglas Jacobson enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in January 1943 at age 18. He came from Rochester, New York, the son of Swedish immigrants who had settled in upstate New York in the 1920s. His father worked in the Eastman Kodak factories, part of Rochester's industrial base that had made the city prosperous during the Depression years. Jacobson had grown up with the expectation that he too would eventually work in the factories, contributing to the machinery of American industrial production. The war changed those plans. Like millions of young men across the country, Jacobson found himself instead contributing to a different kind of production system, one that processed recruits into Marines at a rate and scale unprecedented in the Corps' history. He went through boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina, in the spring of 1943. The training was intensive, designed to break down civilian identity and rebuild it into something harder, something capable of functioning under the stress of combat. Drill instructors pushed recruits through endless hours of close-order drill, physical conditioning, weapons training, and psychological conditioning. The purpose was not subtle. The Marine Corps needed men who would advance under fire, who would follow orders in situations where survival seemed unlikely, who would prioritize unit cohesion over individual preservation. Boot camp provided the foundation for this transformation, but it could not replicate the specific conditions recruits would face in actual combat. Jacobson qualified as a rifleman and received assignment to the 3rd Marine Division. He joined the division as a replacement after it had already seen combat at Bougainville in the Solomon Islands campaign. The division's veterans had experience fighting Japanese forces in jungle terrain, where visibility was measured in yards and ambushes came from any direction. They had learned hard lessons about Japanese defensive tactics, about the tenacity of enemy resistance, about the difficulty of rooting out defenders who refused to surrender. These veterans trained the replacements, passing along practical knowledge that no training manual could convey. They taught how to move through terrain under fire, how to work in fire teams, how to identify likely enemy positions, how to stay alive long enough to learn the rest. But nothing in this training prepared Marines for Iwo Jima's specific challenges. The island's terrain was unlike anything American forces had yet encountered in the Pacific. It was volcanic rock and ash, devoid of the jungle vegetation that had characterized earlier campaigns. There were no trees for concealment, no thick undergrowth to hide movement. The ground itself was treacherous, black volcanic sand that made walking difficult and running nearly impossible. Vehicles bogged down immediately upon landing. Men sank inches into the loose ash with every step, exhausting themselves just moving forward under combat loads. The Japanese defenses were equally unprecedented in their sophistication and depth. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, had spent months fortifying the island. He had studied American tactics in earlier campaigns and concluded that the traditional Japanese strategy of defending at the beaches was suicidal against American firepower. Instead, Kuribayashi built defenses in depth, creating a network of tunnels, bunkers, and pillboxes that would allow his forces to survive preliminary bombardment and exact maximum casualties during the American advance inland. His engineers carved positions out of solid rock, reinforced them with steel and concrete, connected them with tunnels that allowed movement and resupply under American observation. The result was a defensive system specifically designed to neutralize American advantages in artillery, naval gunfire, and air support. The Japanese Type 22 pillbox represented the culmination of defensive engineering lessons learned across 3 years of Pacific warfare. Its design reflected a clear understanding of American assault tactics and a calculated effort to make those tactics as costly as possible. The basic structure consisted of reinforced concrete walls approximately 3 feet thick, poured in sections and allowed to cure until they could withstand direct hits from everything except the largest naval shells or aerial bombs. The walls were embedded with steel reinforcing bars scavenged from destroyed buildings and imported construction materials. The roof was even thicker, often 5 feet or more of concrete and sand, angled to deflect incoming fire and absorb blast effects from near misses. The firing aperture was the pillbox's most carefully designed feature. It was narrow, typically 8 inches high and 30 inches wide, just enough space for a machine gun barrel and the gunner's field of view. The aperture was angled downward and positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire with adjacent positions, creating a web of overlapping kill zones that covered every approach. The interior walls around the aperture were chamfered, angled to prevent grenades from entering and to deflect blast effects outward if one did get through. Some pillboxes incorporated steel shutters that could be closed between bursts of fire, though these were rare due to material shortages. Most relied on the geometry of the aperture itself and the positioning of the gun to prevent direct hits. Inside, the pillbox was surprisingly spacious compared to its external appearance. The fighting compartment provided room for a machine gun crew of 3 to 4 men, plus ammunition storage for extended engagements. The Type 92 heavy machine gun was the standard armament, a 7.7mm weapon that fired from a 30-round metallic strip. The gun's rate of fire was approximately 450 rounds per minute, modest by Western standards but adequate for sustained defensive fire. More importantly, the gun was reliable, capable of firing thousands of rounds without malfunction if properly maintained. The crew had stored ammunition, water, and provisions for extended periods, sometimes weeks, allowing them to remain in position even when surrounded. Ventilation was primitive, consisting of small ports near the roof that could be opened or closed depending on conditions. During sustained fighting, when chemical smoke or cordite fumes filled the fighting compartment, the air became nearly unbreathable. Crews learned to take turns at the firing aperture where fresh air could reach them, rotating positions to avoid asphyxiation. The psychological strain of remaining sealed in a concrete box while the world outside exploded was severe. But Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized holding positions regardless of conditions. Crews were expected to fight until killed, or until the position became completely untenable. The pillboxes were positioned with careful attention to terrain and tactical considerations. Engineers selected locations that provided good fields of fire while remaining difficult to observe from American positions. They were often partially buried, with only the firing aperture and minimal amounts of the structure visible above ground level. The surrounding terrain was shaped to channel American attacks into predetermined kill zones. Approaches were cleared of any cover, forcing attackers to cross open ground under observation. In some cases, engineers created false approaches that appeared to offer concealment, but actually led directly into concentrated fire from multiple positions. The interconnecting tunnel system was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Iwo Jima's defenses. Tunnels allowed Japanese forces to move between positions without exposure to American observation or fire. They provided routes for resupply, evacuation of wounded, and reinforcement of threatened sectors. They allowed positions that appeared isolated to actually function as part of a larger defensive network. An American unit that neutralized one pillbox might find themselves taking fire from another position they thought was already cleared, as Japanese troops moved through tunnels to reoccupy abandoned fighting positions. The psychological effect on American forces was significant. Progress became illusory. Ground that seemed secured could become dangerous again within hours. The 4th Marine Division landed on Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches on February 19, 1945, at 0900 hours. Douglas Jacobson came ashore in the second wave with Company B, 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines. The landing itself was surprisingly unopposed. Marines hit the beach expecting devastating fire, but found instead an eerie quiet broken only by the sound of landing craft engines and shouted orders. Men scrambled up the steep volcanic sand terraces that rose from the water's edge, struggling with the loose black ash that gave way underfoot. Some Marines made it 50 yards inland before the first Japanese shells began falling. The bombardment came from positions the Americans couldn't see, hidden artillery and mortar positions built into the island's interior. Shells burst in the packed landing zones with devastating effect. The black sand, which provided no concealment, also provided no protection. Fragments travelled unimpeded through the loose volcanic material. Men diving for cover found themselves sinking into ash that offered no shelter whatsoever. Within the first hour, casualties mounted rapidly as Japanese gunners found their range and began systematically working over the beach approaches. Naval gunfire tried to suppress the Japanese positions, but struggled to locate targets that remained invisible until they fired. By nightfall of the first day, 30,000 Marines were ashore. They had advanced barely 700 yards inland at the deepest point of penetration. The cost had been 2,400 casualties, including over 550 dead. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. At this rate, taking the entire island would require casualties exceeding the total assault force. Every Marine doing the calculation understood the implications. There would be no easy victories on Iwo Jima, no rapid advance like the ones that had characterized earlier island campaigns. This would be a matter of yards measured in lives, of pillboxes neutralized one at a time, of ground that stayed won only because enough Americans had died taking it. Jacobson's unit spent the first night dug into shallow fighting positions on the terraces overlooking the beach. Japanese artillery fire continued sporadically through the darkness. The noise was constant, a mixture of explosions, small arms fire from probing attacks, and the sounds of wounded men calling for corpsmen. Sleep was impossible. Marines lay in their holes, staring at darkness, listening to the sounds of battle, waiting for dawn and wondering what it would bring. The morning of February 20th brought the first sustained push inland. Jacobson's battalion received orders to advance northeast toward the Prived Island's interior, moving through terrain that offered no natural cover. The objective was a ridgeline approximately 400 yards distant, though the map designation meant nothing to the men who would have to cross that ground. What mattered was the visible terrain ahead, a nightmare of exposed approaches overlooked by higher ground where Japanese observers could direct fire onto any movement. The advance began with artillery preparation. American guns, both naval and those that had been landed and dug in on the beach, fired into suspected Japanese positions. The barrage was impressive, hundreds of shells impacting across the objective area, raising clouds of dust and volcanic ash that obscured the target. When the shelling lifted, Jacobson's company moved out on line, advancing by squads with spacing between men to reduce casualties from artillery. The moment they began moving, Japanese fire opened up from positions the bombardment had failed to neutralize. Machine gun fire came from multiple directions, interlocking fields that covered every avenue of approach. Mortars began dropping shells into the advancing formations with unsettling accuracy. Marines hit the ground, seeking any depression or fold in the terrain that might provide cover. Some found slight depressions where earlier shell impacts had disturbed the volcanic sand. Others simply pressed themselves flat and hoped their silhouettes were small enough to avoid observation. The advance stalled within minutes, pinned down by fire from positions no one could identify. Officers called for supporting fire, for tanks to move forward and suppress the enemy positions, but the terrain made vehicle movement nearly impossible. The loose volcanic sand bogged down everything heavier than a jeep. Jacobson found himself in a shallow crater, with 3 other Marines, all of them pinned by machine gun fire that seemed to be coming from directly ahead. They could hear the bullets snapping overhead, that distinctive crack of rounds passing close. Moving forward was suicide. Staying in place was only slightly better, as Japanese mortar crews walked fire across the area, searching for targets. Someone would have to locate the machine gun position and neutralize it before the company could continue advancing. The tactical problem was elementary and insoluble. A Japanese machine gun position, likely a Type 22 pillbox based on the sustained rate of fire and apparent invulnerability to small arms, was holding up the entire company advance. The position had to be neutralized. The methods for accomplishing this were limited, and all of them required someone to move forward into direct fire. American doctrine for assaulting fortified positions emphasized combined arms, using tanks, artillery, naval gunfire, and air support to suppress enemy positions while infantry maneuvered into assault positions. But Iwo Jima's terrain and the density of Japanese defenses made that textbook approach largely theoretical. Tanks were available but struggled to move through the volcanic sand. The M4A3 Sherman tanks that had landed with the assault force weighed 33 tons. Their tracks, designed for firmer ground, simply churned through the loose volcanic material without gaining traction. Tank crews tried laying down metal matting and logs to create temporary roads, but the effort was slow and required infantry protection that units engaged in combat couldn't provide. When tanks did manage to move forward, they became priority targets for Japanese anti-tank guns and became easily disabled in the difficult terrain. Artillery support was generous by any standard. The Marines had landed with substantial artillery assets and could call on naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers offshore. But the Japanese positions were largely immune to anything except direct hits. Shells that landed close simply threw up clouds of volcanic ash and rock fragments without damaging the reinforced concrete structures. Even direct hits on pillbox roofs often failed to penetrate the multiple feet of concrete and sand. The bombardment suppressed Japanese fire temporarily, forcing crews to shelter inside their positions, but rarely destroyed the positions themselves. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Air support existed but was difficult to coordinate at the tactical level. Close air support missions required clear identification of friendly and enemy positions, adequate time to coordinate the strike, and weather conditions that permitted accurate bombing. In the chaos of ground combat, with front lines measured in yards and positions constantly shifting, calling in airstrikes risked hitting friendly forces. Pilots flying at hundreds of miles per hour struggled to identify individual pillboxes among the volcanic terrain. Most air support went to interdiction missions, attacking Japanese rear areas and trying to disrupt supplies and reinforcements, which left the infantry to solve the tactical problem with the weapons they carried and the courage they could summon. The standard loadout for a Marine rifleman on Iwo Jima included an M1 Garand rifle with 80 rounds of ammunition, 2 fragmentation grenades, 1 smoke grenade, a Ka bar fighting knife, a cartridge belt, suspenders, a haversack with rations and personal items, 2 canteens, an entrenching tool, and a gas mask that most men discarded as useless weight. The total load weighed approximately 50 pounds, though many Marines carried additional ammunition for the squad's Browning automatic rifles or extra grenades scrounged from supply dumps. The M26 fragmentation grenade became the primary weapon for assaulting fortified positions. The M26 had been introduced in 1944 as an improved version of the earlier Mark II grenade. It weighed approximately 1 pound 5 ounces when fully assembled. The body was serrated steel designed to fragment into multiple pieces upon detonation. The filler was 2 ounces of Composition B explosive, a mixture of RDX and TNT that provided greater blast effect than the TNT used in earlier grenades. The fuse was an M204A 2-time delay mechanism, activated by releasing the safety lever after pulling the pin. The delay was 4 to 5 seconds, enough time to throw the grenade and seek cover, but not enough time for an alert enemy to throw it back. Effective throwing range for a grenade depended on the individual Marine's strength and technique. Training standards suggested Marines should be able to throw a grenade 35 to 40 yards, but combat conditions reduced that range considerably. A man carrying 50 pounds of equipment, exhausted from hours of fighting in volcanic sand, under fire, and operating on adrenaline rather than rational thought, could typically throw a grenade 20 to 30 yards, which meant getting close enough to assault a pillbox with grenades required moving into range where the Japanese machine gun could not miss. The tactical calculus was brutal in its simplicity. To neutralize a pillbox, someone had to get within 20 yards, close enough to throw a grenade through the firing aperture, or at least close enough that the explosion would suppress the crew temporarily. Getting within 20 yards of an active machine gun position required crossing open ground under direct observation and fire. The mathematics of probability suggested this was suicide, that the machine gunner would kill the attacking Marine before he could throw his grenade. But the mathematics also showed this was the only method available that had any chance of success. Douglas Jacobson made the decision without consulting anyone, without receiving orders, without the careful planning that doctrine suggested should precede any assault on a fortified position. He simply recognized that his squad was pinned down, that the company's advance had stalled, and that someone needed to do something about the machine gun that was keeping everyone frozen in place. The recognition came with a clarity that surprised him, a sudden understanding that he was the one who would have to move forward because no one else was positioned to do it, and waiting would only make things worse. He had 4 grenades. 2 were M26 fragmentation grenades clipped to his cartridge belt. 2 more were in his haversack, requiring precious seconds to retrieve but providing backup if the first throws missed. The pillbox was approximately 40 yards ahead, though he couldn't see the structure itself. What he could see was the muzzle flash and the trace of the machine gun fire, a visual signature that marked the position with reasonable accuracy. The ground between his crater and the pillbox offered minimal cover, just the slight undulations of volcanic terrain and a few scattered rocks that might provide concealment but would stop nothing. The plan formed in seconds. He would move forward in short rushes, using whatever cover existed to break up his silhouette and make targeting difficult. He would get as close as possible before the Japanese gunner spotted him and reacted. Then he would throw both grenades in rapid succession, giving the crew no time to recover between explosions, and either the grenades would neutralize the position or the machine gunner would kill him. There was no third option. The simplicity of it was almost comforting. No complex tactical problem to solve, no uncertainty about what needed to happen. Just movement and throwing and hoping the mathematics worked out in his favor. He told the Marines in the crater with him what he was going to do. Not asking permission, not seeking approval, just informing them so they would understand what was happening and could provide covering fire if possible. One of them, a corporal whose name Jacobson couldn't later remember, told him he was insane. Another said something about getting support, about waiting for a tank or calling in artillery. Jacobson didn't argue. He just checked that his grenades were secure, made sure his rifle was slung properly so it wouldn't catch on anything, and prepared to move. The first rush covered 15 yards. He rose from the crater and ran in a low crouch, legs churning through volcanic sand that seemed determined to hold him in place. The machine gun was firing at other targets and didn't immediately swing toward him. He dove behind a low ridge of volcanic rock and pressed himself flat, breathing hard, heart hammering, waiting to see if he'd been spotted. No fire came his direction. The machine gun continued engaging targets elsewhere in the company sector. The second rush was shorter, maybe 10 yards, but felt longer because now he was closer and the margin for error had shrunk proportionally. He could see the pillbox clearly now, a low concrete structure partially, buried in volcanic sand with a narrow firing slit barely visible. The machine gun barrel protruded from the aperture, traversing back and forth as the gunner engaged different targets. Japanese voices came from inside the pillbox, muffled by the concrete but audible in the brief pauses between bursts of fire. At least 3 men were inside, probably 4 based on the standard crew size for a Type 92 machine gun. Jacobson was now approximately 25 yards from the pillbox, close enough that his grenades would reach the target but not close enough to guarantee accuracy. He needed to get closer. He looked for the next piece of cover and saw nothing useful, just open volcanic sand between his position and the pillbox, which meant the next move would take him into the open with no concealment and no way to avoid being seen. The machine gunner would spot him immediately. He would have perhaps 3 seconds to close the distance, pull the pin, and throw before the gun swung toward him. He thought about his family in Rochester, about his father working at the Kodak plant, about the assumption that he would survive this war and return home to resume the life that had been interrupted. He thought about the other Marines pinned down behind him, depending on someone to neutralize this position so they could continue advancing. He thought about the statistics he'd heard, that 1 in 3 Marines would become casualties on Iwo Jima, and wondered if his number was up. Then he stopped thinking entirely, because thinking was counterproductive, and what needed to happen required action rather than analysis. He pulled the pin on his first grenade, keeping the safety lever depressed against the grenade body. He took 3 deep breaths, trying to oxygenate his blood for the sprint ahead. Then he stood up and ran directly at the pillbox, no longer caring about concealment or tactics or anything except closing the distance before the machine gun could track him and fire. The machine gun crew spotted him when he was 15 yards away. Jacobson saw the barrel begin to traverse toward him, a movement that seemed impossibly slow and terrifyingly fast simultaneously. He had perhaps 1 second before the gunner completed the traverse and opened fire. His legs were burning from running through volcanic sand, his lungs screaming for air, but he kept moving because stopping meant certain death. At 12 feet from the pillbox, he released the grenade's safety lever and threw in a single fluid motion, not aiming carefully but simply hurling the grenade toward the firing aperture with all the strength desperation could provide. The throw was wrong. He knew it immediately, that sick certainty that comes when muscle memory and intention fail to align. The grenade was traveling too high, the arc too steep. It would clear the firing port completely and detonate somewhere behind the pillbox, wasting the explosive effect and leaving him exposed with the machine gun now tracking directly toward him. Time stretched in that moment, the grenade visible in the air, following its predetermined trajectory while Jacobson watched helplessly and prepared to die. The grenade struck the top edge of the firing aperture. The impact changed its trajectory, redirecting downward at an angle that defied calculation. The grenade bounced once on the concrete lip of the firing port and tumbled into the aperture itself, disappearing into the pillbox's interior. Jacobson was already diving for the ground, seeking any depression that might shield him from the blast. He hit volcanic sand and pressed himself flat, arms covering his head, mouth open to equalize pressure from the coming explosion. The detonation was muffled by the pillbox's thick walls, a dull crump rather than the sharp crack of a grenade exploding in open air. The sound was followed immediately by secondary explosions, as ammunition inside the pillbox cooked off. Smoke poured from the firing aperture. The machine gun, which had been swinging toward Jacobson when the grenade entered, went silent. No more fire came from the position. The voices he had heard inside were gone, replaced by the sound of burning and the pop of ammunition detonating in the flames. Jacobson lay in the volcanic sand for several seconds, unable to process what had happened. He had expected to die. The mathematical probability of his survival had been negligible once he broke cover and ran at the pillbox. Yet he was alive, unmarked except for volcanic ash covering his uniform and minor abrasions from hitting the ground. The pillbox that had held up the entire company advance was neutralized. The impossible throw had worked. Marines from his unit began moving forward, taking advantage of the suppressed fire to advance through the sector. His squad mates reached his position and pulled him to his feet. One of them was shouting something about the throw, about how he'd never seen anything like it, about how the grenade had bounced perfectly into the aperture. Jacobson couldn't respond. His hands were shaking, adrenaline draining from his system and leaving him weak. He had acted without thinking and survived through what everyone watching agreed was pure luck. No amount of training, no tactical skill, no courage could have replicated that bounce. It was chance, accident, the randomness of physics, operating at the intersection of desperation and survival instinct. The company continued advancing. Jacobson's platoon moved past the destroyed pillbox, following the momentum created by that single, neutralized position. They encountered more pillboxes within 100 yards, each requiring similar tactics, similar close assaults, similar acceptance of probable death. Other Marines made their own runs at fortified positions. Some succeeded through skill or luck or both. Others died in the attempt, cut down by machine gun fire before they could throw their grenades. The advance continued, measuring progress in yards, in pillboxes destroyed, in casualties accumulated. By nightfall of February 20th, Jacobson's battalion had advanced approximately 300 yards. The cost was 73 casualties. The next morning, February 21st, Jacobson's unit received orders to continue the advance northeast. The objective was another ridgeline, another cluster of Japanese positions that would require the same tactics that had barely worked the previous day. Jacobson loaded fresh grenades onto his cartridge belt, checked his rifle, and prepared to do it again. Douglas Jacobson survived Iwo Jima. Over the course of the battle, which lasted until March 26, 1945, he participated in multiple assaults on fortified positions. He destroyed a total of 16 Japanese pillboxes using grenades, demolition charges, and on several occasions his rifle fired into firing ports at point-blank range. He killed approximately 75 enemy soldiers through direct action. These numbers were recorded in after-action reports and witness statements, verified by officers who observed his actions and by the physical evidence of destroyed positions. On October 5, 1945, President Harry Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor at a White House ceremony. The citation described his actions as conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But the statistics that defined Jacobson's experience were not his personal tally of destroyed pillboxes or enemy killed. The statistics that mattered were the ones that described what Iwo Jima cost the Marines who fought there. The battle lasted 36 days. American forces committed 70,000 Marines and 18,000 Navy personnel to the assault. Total American casualties reached 26,040. Of these, 6,818 were killed in action or died of wounds. Another 19,148 were wounded but survived. Nearly 1 in 3 Americans who fought on Iwo Jima became a casualty. The Japanese losses were even more catastrophic in proportional terms. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's garrison numbered approximately 21,000 men at the battle's start. Approximately 18,300 died defending the island. Only 216 were captured alive, most of them too severely wounded to continue fighting or Korean laborers who had been pressed into service. The Japanese defenders fought with a tenacity that shocked even veteran Marines who had faced Japanese forces on earlier islands. Kuribayashi's defensive strategy, abandoning the traditional beach defense in favor of defense in depth, proved devastatingly effective at maximizing American casualties, even though it could not prevent ultimate defeat. The island that cost so many lives measured just 8 square miles. At its widest point, Iwo Jima was 2.5 miles across. The volcanic sand beaches where Marines landed comprised less than 1 square mile of relatively flat terrain. The rest was volcanic rock, ridges, ravines, and the dominant terrain feature of Mount Suribachi, rising 546 feet above sea level at the island's southern tip. American forces needed 36 days to secure 8 square miles of volcanic rock against defenders, who had months to prepare fortifications, and who fought knowing there would be no evacuation, no retreat, no survival. The mathematics of that equation, the cost in lives per square mile, exceeded anything American forces had experienced in the Pacific War to that point. The justification for accepting such casualties was strategic. Iwo Jima sat along the flight path between the Marianas Islands, where American B-29 bombers were based, and Tokyo. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima could intercept bombers during their missions, and Japanese radar stations could provide early warning of incoming raids. Capturing Iwo Jima would eliminate these threats. More importantly, it would provide an emergency landing site for damaged B-29 seconds returning from missions over Japan. The bombers, flying at the extreme edge of their range, had no margin for battle damage or mechanical failure. Without Iwo Jima, a damaged B-29 had to ditch in the ocean with minimal chance of crew survival. With Iwo Jima secured, damaged bombers could reach the island's airfields and attempt emergency landings. The first B-29 made an emergency landing on Iwo Jima's Motoyama Airfield No. 1 on March 4, 1945, while the battle for the island's northern sectors was still ongoing. The bomber had sustained damage during a raid on Tokyo and could not return to the Marianas. The emergency landing saved the lives of 11 crew members who would otherwise have been lost. Over the following months, 2,400 emergency landings occurred at Iwo Jima's airfields. Each landing represented a bomber crew that survived rather than dying in the ocean. Each represented millions of dollars of aircraft preserved rather than lost. The strategic calculus suggested that Iwo Jima's capture, despite its horrific cost, was justified by these results. But for the men who fought there, for Marines like Douglas Jacobson who survived through combination of skill and chance, the strategic justification mattered less than the immediate experience of combat reduced to its most elemental form. Iwo Jima had been a battle where every yard forward required someone to accept probable death and move anyway, where courage was measured not in grand gestures, but in the willingness to stand up and run toward a machine gun position when every instinct screamed to stay down, where survival depended as much on luck as on training or equipment or tactical skill. Douglas Jacobson returned to the United States in December 1945. He was 20 years old, a veteran of one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, and the recipient of his nation's highest military decoration. He attended the Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House, met President Truman, and received the recognition that came with extraordinary valor in combat. Then he went home to Rochester and tried to resume the life that had been interrupted by the war. He enrolled at Syracuse University using the GI Bill, studying business administration. He married his high school sweetheart. He took a job with Eastman Kodak, working in the same industrial complex where his father had worked, contributing to the peacetime economy that had replaced wartime production. But the war never entirely left him. He rarely spoke about Iwo Jima in the years immediately following his return. When people asked about his Medal of Honor, he provided brief, factual answers that conveyed no sense of the experience itself. He attended Medal of Honor Society conventions and reconnected with other recipients, finding that they alone understood the weight of survival when so many had died. He participated in veterans' events and spoke to students about military service, but he focused on the broader themes of duty and sacrifice rather than the specific details of combat. In later years, as the generation that fought World War II aged and historians worked to preserve their accounts, Jacobson became more willing to discuss his experiences. He gave interviews for oral history projects. He participated in documentaries about Iwo Jima. He returned to the island in 1995 for the 50th anniversary commemoration of the battle, walking the ground where he had fought and seeing how time had softened the volcanic terrain that had been so unforgiving in combat. He met Japanese veterans who had survived the battle, and they shared the recognition that both sides had suffered terribly in a fight that neither side could have avoided once the strategic decision to invade had been made. What emerged from these later accounts was a consistent theme that Jacobson returned to repeatedly. The grenade throw that everyone remembered, the impossible bounce into the pillbox that had seemed like miraculous luck, was not the action that defined his experience of Iwo Jima. That moment lasted seconds. What defined the battle was the sustained requirement, day after day, to continue advancing into positions where death was the most probable outcome. The grenade throw was spectacular, but it was not fundamentally different from dozens of other actions he and thousands of other Marines performed during the battle. Every advance toward a pillbox was a gamble with death. Every assault on a fortified position required accepting terrible odds and moving anyway. The broader lesson, the one that Jacobson believed mattered more than any individual act of valor, was about the nature of that kind of combat and what it demanded from the men who fought it. Iwo Jima had not been won through technological superiority or tactical brilliance. American forces had possessed both, yet the battle still required 36 days of brutal fighting and cost 26,000 casualties. The island was won because enough Marines were willing to stand up under fire and move forward when everything in their survival instinct told them to stay down. Some survived these actions through skill, some through luck, most through some combination of both. Many died making the attempt, but collectively, through thousands of individual acts of courage that ranged from the spectacular to the mundane, they advanced yard by yard until the island was secured. Douglas Jacobson died on August 21, 2009, at age 84. He had lived a full life, raised a family, contributed to his community, and carried the memories of Iwo Jima with dignity and quiet strength for 64 years. His Medal of Honor citation described one day of combat, one series of actions that destroyed 16 pillboxes and killed 75 enemy soldiers. But the real story was not about spectacular valor in a single day. It was about the sustained willingness to continue fighting in conditions where survival seemed improbable and where every day forward required accepting the mathematics of probable death. The grenade that bounced into the pillbox on February 23, 1945, represented a moment of pure chance, physics operating at the intersection of desperation and need. It should not have worked. The throw was wrong, the trajectory too high, the outcome dependent on an accidental bounce that no one could have predicted or replicated. That it worked at all was luck, but that Jacobson was in position to make the throw, that he had moved forward when staying down was safer, that he had closed to 12 feet from an active machine gun position, because that was the only way to neutralize the target. That was not luck. That was the product of training, courage, and the recognition that sometimes the only way forward requires accepting death as the most likely outcome and moving anyway. Iwo Jima taught this lesson to everyone who fought there, to the 26,000 Americans who became casualties, and to those who survived. It taught that modern warfare between industrial powers creates situations where individual courage matters less than collective will, where tactical problems sometimes have no good solutions, only necessary ones. It taught that victory in such circumstances comes not through avoiding casualties, but through accepting them as the unavoidable cost of strategic objectives that cannot be abandoned. And it taught that the men who bear that cost, who stand up and run toward pillboxes knowing the mathematics are against them, deserve to be remembered not for the moments when luck favored them, but for the sustained choice to continue fighting when every rational calculation suggested the price was too high. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.